So they added this float perk for Zen a couple seasons back, and at first people weren't talking about it, saying it was map dependent, but then I started getting to work researching. I found some interesting things, like this. So if you want to become a disgusting freak of nature on this character, get this guy away from me. Oh my god, dude. Here's every Zenyatta float spot in Overwatch. First things first, I gotta explain some tech here. This will all be necessary for the difficult spots and make some others more smooth, and will also explain the double jump emote tech I discovered that I've been calling a medlev. So, starting from the beginning. You get the minor perk called Ascendance, and you can now float in the air for up to 3 seconds. You can start floating by holding your jump button when you're in the air. You also gain a slight bit of elevation during these 3 seconds. There's no cooldown other than the fact that once you've stopped floating, you have to stand on the ground again to reset the use of this. One thing to note is that all of your upward momentum is removed when you start floating. So if you use a jump pad and want the most height, make sure to only start floating at the very top of that jump. You can sometimes use this to your advantage, however, by throwing off the aim of a Junkrat who launched you in the air, for instance. If you're initiating your float by jumping, you can do it in 2 ways. The first season perks were introduced, you had to jump and manually let go and hold the jump button again to start floating, whereas the next season added the ability to just hold your jump key both to jump and start floating. It might seem like these two do the same thing, but there's a very slight difference. If you manually repress your jump key and hold it at the very top of your jump, you could get a little bit more height this way. Not much, we're talking about a centimeter maybe, but definitely worth noting for some of these more difficult jumps we'll get into. If you want to get a little bit more distance out of your float and don't care about the height as much, you can do what I call a delayed float by jumping forward and starting your float after you drop down as far as you're able to while still being able to land where you need to go. Since you haven't started your float yet, this extra air time without floating means you get to stay in the air floating for a little bit longer. Video game geometry is a bit strange compared to what you'd think. If you run into a ledge with your feet and with some speed, it acts as if it's a rounded edge, though it's probably you who is rounded, and bumps you upwards a little bit. You can use this ledge bump to get just a little bit more height out of your float. I found that if you're bumping a ledge right next to you, you can get 3 good bumps out of it at the right speed in 1 use of Ascendance. The steeper the angle of the edge, the better, not to mention corners like these working a little bit better too. Now, here's my magnum opus to provide for the Zenyatta community, the medlev, a brand new tech I developed that I haven't seen anyone else using. Most of the sit emotes pop you up in the air when you cancel them, but with Zenyatta's meditation emote and the Ascendance perk, he just straight up gets a double jump that he could extend forward. I've been calling this a medlev, short for meditation levitation. Catchy, right? Now here's the step-by-step on how to do this. Start by having the meditation emote equipped. While it's definitely possible without this, I recommend having the emote bound to a key to press quickly and consistently. I have mine on N, right next to my spacebar to hit them quickly by sliding my thumb across both of them. There's a bit of delay between when you hit the emote key and when it actually starts playing. Try pressing your emote key and jumping immediately after. You can also practice the timing by trying to walk off the edge or onto a jump pad and pressing your emote just before. Once you get that, just start floating in the air and you're doing a medlev. You can do the floating part with any emote. I do this plenty for silly maxing purposes, but the double jump aspect requires a meditate emote specifically. Of course, there's a few caveats to this. The major one being that you're stuck in the emote for a given time, so it's not really great during a fight. You also can't control your direction once you're going, so if you get bounced off course like these dinosaurs in this meme I think about way too frequently, you're flying in that direction for a hot minute. Lastly, the timing of this emote, and specifically the double jump part, can't be controlled, which makes the jumps a little finicky, but there's a way to mitigate this. During my research, I've thought of 3 different styles of medlev that I've used. There's the basic medlev, where you just send yourself full speed at something. There's the double jump medlev, where you just medlev in place so that you could catch something on an edge that's just above you. Then there's a slow medlev. This one's probably the most difficult, as it requires you not only to perform all the inputs at just the right time, but also the speed matters. So you have to make it slower, but not too slow and not too fast. The way this works is by using the fact that in Overwatch, you don't immediately go up to full walking speed, it kind of ramps up over time. Long story short, just tap forward as you're jumping up in the air, and you should start getting the feel for the timing of it. There's also a jump pad medlev, not so catchy. To do this, you start off with a normal medlev, but you land on a jump pad just before the double jump hits. The extra momentum from the double jump sends you flying way higher, and landing on the jump pad counts as being grounded, which resets your float for when you're up in the air again. To get the most height, you could either have a known spot that will drop you onto the jump pad just as you get the double jump, or if you're good with slow medlevs, you could use that at any angle up close. So I accidentally found something pretty silly.
As does failure.
What the hell was that?
How did I do that? Hang on.
What did you do?
I was trying to float like this, but I like mistimed the actual floating part, and I think I landed on the ground, but only kind of.
So freaking
that-
doing
whoa,
Zombie.
Yeah, I can make Zen throw it back now. Pretty easy to explain. You just do a medlev, except you start floating exactly as you hit the ground. One interesting bit is you don't always get the same length of twerk time, suggesting that this isn't frame perfect or has some essence of RNG to it. And since I'm a glutton for completeness, here's what all of the emotes look like, except for Dalsum Wins. I'm sorry I don't have that one. Anyway, I hope you guys have fun with this one. There's one other thing that I literally just found 20 minutes before I hopped in with you, Yukari.
Yeah.
It is curved.
This is very.
Oh, there it is. There it is.
Oh,
What? That's a more important tech. I can make Zen twerk now. You can make him twerk. All right, now that we've gotten the tech guide and nomenclature out of the way, time to get to the maps. A couple things I want to mention is that to keep this video from being even more massive than it already is, I made a lot of use of speeding up some footage. I've limited this mostly to spots that are pretty basic, but I wanted to mention it here so you guys know. Also, since they've reworked New Junk City and Suravasa during the creation of this, I doubled back through those maps, but decided not to re-record the spots that still work to save some time. So that might look a little bit weird. Also, I recorded the medlev tech in the middle of making this, so the recording quality is a little bit different on those clips as well. And finally, any of these spots and the related tech should also work for their stadium counterparts, but I'm not a stadium player, so I'll leave finding spots specific to stadium maps up to you guys. Okay, love you, bye! For Aatlis, I couldn't find too much, but you could float across these high grounds here. You could also split off in the other direction and float over to this high ground. And you could continue this way onto even more high grounds. You could do a medlev off of this trash can here to make it onto this high ground. And you could skip the stairs by delaying the float part of your medlev from this high ground to the other. On first point, you could jump across all these high grounds. This also gets you into the window. You could also jump off the boxes into this window. If you drop down low enough to not bump your head, you could jump on this yellow thing, and that gets you onto these high grounds. If you jump on this railing, that gets you on top of this wall, which can also get you onto those high grounds. You could barely make the jump on these bigger boxes, but Ascendance gets you on top of these smaller ones. You could also float over to this other building. Another way onto those initial boxes is by jumping on these small ones off to the side and floating on top. You could actually stand on top of this light right here. However, it's only present on this side of the map. You could jump onto this pipe, and that gets you onto this high ground. However, you don't need anything else to float into these windows. You can jump onto this railing to get onto this red thing, which gets you a nice view over the wall. However, if that railing is broken, you could jump onto this pipe, and you could also stand on this little post thing here. This isn't much, but it gets you a view onto the point for a second. And you could also use this railing to completely jump over this wall if you want. You could float around this piece of ice as a nice way to juke people. You can float onto these boxes and then float up to this high ground. Jumping on top of this wall is possible without Ascendance, but it requires really specific spots. Ascendance lets you slot into the spots you could stand on a lot easier. Here's how you could jump into the wall on this side. And for these walls on main, you can use a couple of medlevs to get your way up. Here's the same thing on the other side. With a bit of foresight, you could jump onto this box poking out of the wall, and you might be able to dodge something like a shatter. With some ledge bumps, you could jump onto this wall near spawn. On third point, it's a bit difficult, but you can make it onto this wall from this bench. The trick is you have to not bump your head, and you have to ledge bump at the right time. The way I like to time it is going for 1, 2, 3. This is probably obvious, but you could jump from this high ground to the one in the middle. You could do the same using the railing, using these boxes. You could even use the staircase itself. You could stand on the corners of this thing holding the ice, and that gets you up onto this high ground. There's a bunch of things here that you could stand on if you want to stay off the ground. And while you could technically make this jump without ascendance, it makes the whole process way more consistent. You can ledge bump onto the base of this statue, which gets you onto the next statue's base, which gets you onto the high ground. You could also stand here. Another way onto this high ground is standing on these hay bales and jumping onto this wood post. You could also stand where this staircase bumps you up a little bit and jump on this post. You could jump onto these boxes to float to the high ground. You could also use these boxes to jump onto this high ground. You can jump onto this barrel or this trash can to jump onto this stand. You could just barely float from this high ground onto the other one. To get back, you have to do a medlev with a delayed float. You could jump onto this sign, which gets you over to the turret. You don't need the perk to jump onto this circle thing, but it definitely helps. You could medlev off of this turret over this bridge thing here to pull off an unexpected flank. You could jump onto this sign to get up to this high ground. You could stand on this thing to get a good view down main. You could float over to this grass spot to jump onto this stand. There's a few ways to get onto this high ground. You could jump onto this stone wall. You could ledge bump your way onto this stone wall. Or you could jump onto or ledge bump your way up this stone wall. To get up from the defender's side, you could use this stone wall. Using this float spot gets you a nice view onto main. You could also float over onto this wall. On first point, you could jump on this planter and get onto this high ground with some ledge bumps. You could also get to the other high grounds from here. You could also get up here by using this little railing thing. You could jump onto this thing in the middle of the point, hop on this ledge, and from here you could do a medlev onto the high ground. Jumping on this vending machine lets you float over to the high ground from here. You could already make these jumps without ascendance, however with it you could use the railings to get into this window, as well as onto the drum in this area. Also, doing a medlev means that you don't need the railings to do either of those jumps. You could jump onto the statue's head, and from there you could float onto various high grounds. You could stand on the turtle's head, either by floating from the stairs here, or by doing a medlev right next to it. From the staircase here, if you space out your medlev appropriately, you could land on the side of this drum. You could use the double jump aspect of a medlev to get onto the high ground from here. You could float from one high ground to the other. You could float over to this spot, might work for a nice flank. You could stand on these platforms that raise and lower. You could float around this wall, and you can make it back the other way too. If you delay your ascendance, you could just barely make it over here. You could float onto this pillar, which gives you a nice sight onto the choke. You could stand on this little wall. You could use a medlev to double jump up to this thing if you can't get around it. A medlev off of this railing gets you onto the high ground right outside of their spawn. You can float around this wall to this high ground. From this railing, you could just float over to this high ground. However, a medlev into the corner gets you up there without the railing. You can stand on the railings or these tables to get up to this height with some ledge bumps. A medlev off of this car gets you up to this high ground. You can medlev off the base of this statue to get onto this high ground. You can float from this high ground around to the other one around the corner. You can float up to this grass area, and from there you can float onto this high ground. Ascendance makes this jump a lot more consistent. You can clear the jump onto this rooftop. You can also very easily do the same from these boxes. And from the roof, you could float onto this sign. You could float from this wall thing onto the high ground. You could float from this bridge thing over to the opposite high ground. Another way is doing a medlev from here. And to get back to the high ground, you could do a medlev as well. Jumping around this corner could be a good way to juke someone. You could stand on this balcony. It doesn't give you much cover though. You could float onto this grass spot, onto these rocks, and from there you could get up to the high ground. You could do the same thing on the other side, starting off of this car. You could also skip the rocks by doing a medlev off of the grass spot. Using the stairs a little bit, you could float over to this high ground. And even without the stairs, you could just do a medlev. If you stand on this rock, you could ledge bump your way up to the top. And from there you could medlev onto the height. You could float onto this grass spot using the hill here or the staircase over here. This gives you enough height to float back onto the bridge. You might be able to juke somebody by doing this. You can float on top of these metal things. You could use this ledge to get you up onto the high ground. You can also do it from the staircase. This isn't practical, but a nice way to practice your medlevs. Using the railings, you could medlev onto this high ground. You could also medlev to make it onto the bridge from here. You could use the railings with a medlev to get onto the bridge. This is probably only useful for spawn camping, but you can medlev off of the rock stack onto this wall. In this room, you could use a medlev to get onto any of the door frames here. To get up on this high ground, you have a few options. One is floating off of this van. You could also use this plant, if it's still here, to jump onto the sign, and then from there you could float on up. If you need to go around, you could use this hill to jump up, though a better way would just be to jump right over here. And finally, you could do a medlev on this side from the van. You could float around up into this window, and you could go from this window to the other high ground to dodge somebody. You can fall onto this rooftop, and from there you can make it to the other rooftops. You could jump on top of this statue even without ascendance, but it makes it a lot easier. You can stand in this corner and hide inside of the leaves of this tree. You can float over to this high ground, and from there, I don't know why you would go here, but you could definitely make this jump too. Speaking of weird flanks, you could float all the way around this way. Another spot you could hide at is on the little ridges of this doorway. If you need to get the high ground, you could jump on this statue, jump onto this gate thing, and float all the way up. You could do a similar thing from the courthouse, though it's a little bit more difficult with a medlev that needs to be timed appropriately. You could also float from this van to land on this little metal bit and then jump right up. You could also jump on this plant, this electrical box, and then do the same thing. Similarly, you could jump up to this high ground. You could ledge bump onto the high ground from here. You can stand on these windows. Floating around this way could be a nice way to dodge somebody. You could float on this box and maybe get some shots. It's risky, but with a medlev you can jump over this wall. If the railings are here, you could float over to the high ground by landing on this corner and then jumping up. On the fender's side, you could do something similar from here with a medlev. You could float from here to get a decent off angle. You could float from the ground to this staircase. From the payload, you could ledge bump onto this height. And with the medlev, you could do the same thing from this bastion turret. From the same spot, you could get over to this bridge, and from there you could get to that same staircase. Another way onto that bridge is jumping from these stairs. If you're fast enough, you might be able to get a nice spawn camp by jumping over this way. Another spawn camp opportunity for second point is standing on this ledge. If you find the right spot to stand, you could float over to this scaffolding, though it's probably easier with a medlev. If you stand as high as you could go into this right side, then you can medlev over to the corner on the left side over here. And there's a spot where if you push into the corner, it acts as a stuck spot and it'll pop you up, sending you over the edge here. Defenders can do something similar by floating over to this little high ground, jumping on this destroyed turret, and floating over the top. A couple options for getting to that height is jumping on the rocks over here, and then just floating over. If you're over here, you could float on top of castle by doing a medlev. One very useful spot is standing on top of this little doorway to get up to the high ground. You could jump on this rock wall, and then do a slow medlev to get onto the scaffolding over here. If you stand on this ledge, you could find the right spot that pushes you up just enough to do a medlev to double jump over the wall here. A lot of people know this sequence of jumps, but with Ascendance you could float into the window, and then from there you could float over to the scaffolding bit over here. However, a medlev could get you there without having to go into the window first. From here, you could float onto either high ground. And you could also do a medlev here to get to the high ground. From the tip of this table, you could do a medlev to make it over to this high ground. And from here, you could get onto both of the chandelier spots. This one's the easier one to get to, though you can make it over to this one too if you aim it right. You could also make it onto this back chandelier here. You could skip the stairs by floating up this way. You could float all the way to this window. You could float over to this high ground, and on this side you could just jump up here, but on this side you can't, so you need Ascendance to float up here. You could float back onto this high ground with a medlev. You could float from here into the window. If you stand on just the edge of this wall, you could float into this window. On this side it's a little bit easier. If you use a railing, you could get into the window here. You could also float from this high ground into the window. If you jump off of this car, you could get into this high ground. You could use this little fountain thing to get up here. I don't know if these signs are useful, but you could stand on them. You could use a medlev off this trash bin to jump up here. You could stand on the edge of this wall, and that can get you up to this high ground. And from there, you could stand on this windowsill. You could float to the high ground from this side. You could float from this bench up onto this wall. You could float from the high ground into these window spots. Another way into the windows is by jumping on these things. You might be able to use this to juke somebody. You could use the corners of this rock to float up to this high ground. You could also do a medlev on top of this rock. You could use the slight amount of height that these spots give you to get you up onto the high ground with a medlev. You could float on top of this wall. You could also use this electrical box to get up there. You could use a medlev to get on top of this electrical box. You could use this trash bin to float onto this wall and stand on any of these signs. You could use a high ground out of spawn to get onto this banner. From there you could float into this window. From here you could float into this other high ground. You could also get up there from the staircase. If you're trying to spawn hold, you could jump onto this truck and float onto the roof here. And you could jump on the high ground here as well. You could also do a medlev off of this electrical box. You could use any of these cars to jump on top of here to get up to any of these high grounds. From here, you could float around on each of these little divots. You could also make it into the window spot here. Another way onto this balcony is from down here. You need a medlev to float into the window from here. You could recontest from high ground by jumping on this forklift and floating to the high ground here. You could jump on top of this shelf to get up to the high ground. You used to need the railings to make this jump, but now you could just float. You can also do this jump on the opposite side to float up to the high ground a little bit easier. Another way to get up top is jumping on this barrel and this pipe. You could already jump on top of these canisters, but Ascendance lets you fall into the barrels and into this high ground position. You could use this medlev spot to approach from a different angle. You could jump up these rocks, and on any of these corners you could actually stand on, which allows you to jump into this window area. Another option is by ledge bumping into this black box thing. You could use these boxes to access this hole in the wall. You could get up to this high ground by jumping on these rocks and floating over, or you could jump onto this black box and float. One way to get to high ground is jumping on this lamppost, this stoplight, and jumping up. You could also medlev from this car up onto this left side high ground. You might be able to spawn camp by standing on either of these posters. You can medlev off of this car up to the high ground. You could jump on this dumpster, float onto the boxes, float onto this height, and then you could actually jump onto the high ground over here. This is pretty niche, but you could medlev onto this air conditioning unit right here, or you could just float from this position. You could double jump with a medlev to get up to this high ground. You can medlev across the rooftop and jump over the wall here. Jumping on these cases gets you onto any of these rooftops, and from there you could jump onto this wall, and you could actually medlev onto the high ground. At the very top of this roof, you can medlev across to this high ground. These hay bales could get you onto the rooftops as well. You could float on top of this electrical box. These hay bales also get you onto the rooftops. From here, you could float on top of jail, and once you're there, you could actually float on top of saloon. You could jump on this camera and use that to float onto the high ground. You could jump on top of these cases and do a medlev to get on top of jail. Another way is doing a medlev off of this box. And you could also medlev off of this box. Fun fact, you could actually stand on this ledge. And probably the craziest thing you could do is standing on this corner of this beam here. You could use this meteor to stand on this panel here. And you could also float onto this camera, but it doesn't really get you anywhere. You could stand on the legs of this rocket. If you aim it just right to not bump yourself off course, you could use this medlev to get up to this high ground. If you're up here, you could float over to this large panel and use it as a way to get across this way without going in the room. You could medlev off of these boxes to get up to this height. You could use this case to float over to this side. Floating to this box could be a nice way to get a jump on somebody. You could use the edge of this electrical box to jump up on top of it. You could do a medlev off of that box to get to this high ground. You could get on top of the RV and use this satellite dish to get just enough height to just float to the high ground. You could float from one side of cage to the other. You could also use this to float clear over this rooftop. You could do a medlev onto this corner. You can float over to this high ground now, and you could also stand in this window. If you drop from there, you could stand in any of the doorways here, though you do have to crouch. One way to maintain your distance is floating over this way and just spamming down into the point. You can technically make this jump without ascendance, but it makes it a whole lot more consistent. You might be able to dodge somebody by floating around through this window. At least on this side of the map, you could use this thing over here to float onto that same corner. The other side of the map doesn't have that though. If you drop out this way, you could jump back onto point by using the ledge here. You could follow this route to jump up onto the high ground. You can now access this high ground here, though I'm not sure if it's very useful. There's a couple different medlev spots you could use to get up there as well. On this side, you could use this corner as well, but it's pretty difficult to actually make. You can float onto this geometry on the way out to be a little bit less predictable, just in case you get spawn camped. You can walk onto this wall and float onto the high ground either this left side or on this right side. You could also float over to this high ground now. And from there, you could use a couple of medlevs to act as double jumps to get up to this iconic widow spot. You could stand on this little pillar, in fact all of them you could stand on, and you could also float from this side of the cage over to the other. You can do a medlev on top of this corner. From this corner, you could also medlev into that same widow spot. You could float over to this edge of the map and wait for somebody to come out and try to kick them off of the edge. This side of the map, you could do the same thing over here. This one's kind of nice because you could just float right back up here. You could float over this way to get up to this high ground a little bit faster. This jump's a bit easier with Ascendance. You could do a medlev from here up to this high ground, and you could do the same thing from here as well. You have a few options to jump up to this high ground here. You could use this little edge over here to jump onto this other edge and float on up. On this side, you could jump on these rocks and just float around. Once you're up here, you could float onto this pillar here. You do have to do a medlev to make it to the other pillar. You could also jump on this wall thing here. This also lets you jump onto the high ground here. You could also jump on this little light thing. Over here on point, there's a jump you could do to make it up here, but it's a little bit of a specific spot, so Ascendance helps you out there. You can float to this roof either from spawn or from this railing. You're able to stand on this edge, and from there you can float over the top of this roof. You can float into the high ground window from here. Standing on this edge will make that a little bit easier. Standing on this couch to jump onto this little wall could get you off of the ground. You could medlev in either of these directions to get onto the high ground. You could float around this silo to get over to this rock over here. These cars here can get you up to this high ground. You could jump on these barrels on top of these cars, and then you could follow this little bit of roof here to float onto the high ground. If you do a medlev off of this gear thing, that also gets you to this high ground. You could float over to this window, as well as this high ground. These boxes can get you up to the high ground. You could use this barrel to get up to the top of the fidget spinner, though you could skip the barrel if you do a medlev. You could also medlev onto this little robot thing here. You're able to float around this wall onto the high ground. If you find a way to get up here, you could medlev to this spot. You could medlev to get to the top of this phone booth, and then from there you could stand on the edge of this doorway and jump on up. You could also medlev onto this phone booth and use that to medlev onto the top of the bus. You could take this right side out of spawn to float onto the top of the theater. You could already use this sign to jump up onto statue, though now you could use this sign to jump up as well. You could just barely float into the window from here. You could use this bush to push you up just a little bit to get you up onto this height, though a medlev can get you up there as well. You could also just float from here. You could also use this car to get up there. From the top of this phone booth, you could just barely medlev up here. You have to get a ledge bump during your medlev. That doesn't bump you off course though. You could float from here onto this sign, which is a nice way to get onto the high ground. You could use this sign and a very slow version of a medlev to jump up onto the ledge here. You could float from this high ground to any of the other bits of high ground here. You could also now access this high ground here. You could also float there from here, though it takes a few specific ledge bumps to get up properly. I would recommend just doing a medlev. You can now access this little grating of high ground. You can get up into this window in a couple of different ways. Being up here allows you to take this high ground, as well as the one across this way. Another way to get up there is by doing a medlev from these boxes. You can now just float up to these high grounds. And from there you could float up to this door frame here, and from there you could double jump with a medlev to get up to the height. You could also medlev all the way from these boxes onto that door frame to do the same thing. You could float on the roof of this building and get onto the wall. You could also use these statues to get to either high ground. You could stand on this thing to get onto this wall. Then you could also jump on these things, and from that wall you could float into the windows. Another way to get into these windows is using these chairs, though you could also use a medlev. It's not practical, but you can float over to this spot here, and you could jump over this way to reset. You could do a slow version of the Lucio rollout. You could do the same with these rocks as well. You could also get to the window from this bridge. You could use this rock to get onto the high ground. This could potentially work for a nice juke spot. You also might be able to dodge somebody floating this way. One way to break this choke is by floating around here. You could float onto this pillar. If you stand on the ledge here, you could float onto the top of the wall, but you could also get onto the high ground. You could also do a medlev to get up there. Just note that while you could stand on this wall, you can't stand on this one. Jumping on this pillar is technically possible without ascendance, but it makes it a lot easier. You could also jump to this pillar from the rover. However, on this side, it's a different object, so you can't really jump up it. You can also stand on this ledge. You could use the stairs to stand on this sign. You could also stand on this corner. Using these stairs can get you into the window. You could stand on the edge of this picture frame and a couple of the windows in this building. In the fire station, you could stand on the edge of this picture. From here, you could fall into the fire truck, which gives you access to this high ground and this high ground. If you want to get into this window, you gotta jump from this high ground and bump into this little edge. Also from this high ground, you could access these little divots here. You could also get there with a medlev. Another way to get onto any of these high grounds is using this taxi. One way to get up here is using this edge and a medlev. You could also medlev off of this piece of machinery and float onto the high ground. There's a couple different vehicles you could use to medlev onto the high ground here on either side. You can stand on this wall here. You could float across these windows. On this side you could get to the high ground using this bus. Alternatively, you could get in through this window. You could stand on this small wall, as well as this one. You could get onto this pillar by using any of these walls. You can do a medlev if you space it appropriately to get up here. And you can do the same here, just make sure you space it just right. You could also float into this spot. This is a nice spot to try to catch someone off guard. You can now clear this jump just off of the ground. You can jump onto this stand. You can also jump onto this one. And from there you can get into this window. You could also stand on any of these objects. You're also able to float onto this wall, as well as this wall. A very well aimed medlev could get you into this window. You could use this wall to access the height. You could also medlev off of the railing here. You could stand on here, and from there you can medlev across the roof. You could float under here, and you could just barely float under the stairs up here. There's a spot here that pokes you up just a little bit to float on top of this pillar, and that could get you to the height. You could medlev into these rocks to stand on them, and from there you can medlev onto the bridge. On this side you could use these logs, and on this side you could use this little snowbank. You can medlev from here onto the high ground. You can stand on top of these walls. You can stand on this bell. You can medlev right here to avoid the stairs. You can medlev on this snowbank to get up. You can float from this railing to get up here. You can float on this elephant statue head and medlev up to the high ground. You can medlev in this corner to get up. You can also medlev up to this wall. You can more easily float up to this elephant statue. It's really difficult, but you can medlev over this rooftop. You can medlev from the elephant statue onto this wall. You can float onto the high ground from this horse. You can stand on top of these pillars. Another way to the high ground is by jumping off this pot. You could already jump on this ledge, but Ascendance makes it more consistent. You can float over to the opposite high ground. You can medlev onto the horn of this elephant statue and get on top of it. If you want to do a really weird flank, you could float around the edge of the map here. You could use this piece of furniture to float onto this height. You could also medlev off of this furniture piece to get up to the same height. You could stand in either of these windows. You can medlev onto this shelf. You can float across here and back. Though a more fun spot is if you medlev off of here to land on the edge of these pillars. You could also float from either side spawn onto the pillars. You could float from this snowbank onto this side's high ground. Though you could also medlev against this wall. From that high ground, you could stand on this section of roof. You could also float on there from here. Or you could use this gong. If you're up here, you could stand on the edge of these pillars. And from there, you can medlev onto the roof. You could use this snowbank to save a little bit of time getting around here. You could use this car to get onto the high ground. You could also use it to float onto these other spots. Over here you could stand on this tire and get onto this pipe to jump up here. You could also use these bombs to do the same thing on this end. You could just barely use a medlev to stand on this thing. You could stand on this ledge on this side of the map. You could jump on these barrels, then jump on this thing to get onto the height. Though that last thing you need to jump on is destructible, so if it's gone you can do a medlev. You could float onto this pillar. You could use these barrels to stand on this wall thing, or you could use this little ramp. You could float onto this part of the point from here, or you can medlev off of this railing. On this point, there's a lot of different spots you could float onto, so just get creative with it. You might be able to juke somebody out by floating around here. If you delay a medlev a little bit so you don't bump your head later on, you could float over to this pillar. You could float over to this pillar and get onto this high ground. If you space it out properly, you could medlev onto this high ground a little bit faster. If someone's chasing you, you could medlev up here to dodge them. You could float up into this doorway. You could float around onto the high ground from here. You could float onto the point from here. You could medlev onto this pillar. You could float over to this pillar. You could float onto this bus stop and get onto the pillar this way as well. You could jump onto this bus stop, float to this pillar, and get onto the height. You could also jump over this way to do the same thing. Pretty obviously, you could float onto the bus from here, though you could also medlev from here. And at least on this side of the map, you could float onto it by jumping on these newspaper boxes. You could also medlev from there to get into this spot. You could medlev from here to get onto this height, ignore the bump. You could jump onto this hockey statue a bit easier. You could stand on top of this doorway. If you stand in the right spot, you can medlev onto this bus. You can make it on top of this bus from the ground. You can also use this car to get on there. From the top of this bus, you can medlev onto this height. You can make it up to the high ground from here. You could also medlev to get up in this direction. You could just barely make it from this high ground to this statue, And from the statue, you can make it to this high ground. You could jump on this map sign to make it to this height. You could also medlev to get onto the statue from here. It's close, but you could just barely make it around this wall. You could float from here to make it to the bus. You could also use this car to get onto the bus. And from the bus, you can medlev onto this high ground. You can save time climbing the stairs by going this way. You could float onto this high ground. You could also float over to this spot here. You could float from this grass to make it onto this high ground. You could also float from these grass bits onto the high ground on this end. You could float to and from this med pack. You could float around the cars to get around here. You could float over to this pillar. You could juke somebody by jumping off the side here and then floating right back on. You could jump off of this trash can onto this little vase pillar thing. Pretty obviously you could float to the middle here. You could ledge bump up here, but you could also medlev out of spawn to get up here smoother. You could stand on this roof. You could stand on these grass areas here. You could juke people by jumping off the edge and landing here. You could medlev up to this spot, just make sure you space it right to ledge bump at the very end of it. You could float over to these grassy high grounds. You could float around this wall onto the stairs. You could float over to this spot. You could use this bench to float onto these walls, as well as these staircases on the side. Doing a medlev from these benches could get you up on the height. You could also stand on this wall in case you need to fight for this height. You could use this grass spot to jump onto the train to get onto height. You could also use this grass spot and this car. You could also use that grass spot or this trash can to get up to this spot. If you don't want to use the stairs, you could jump on this car, jump on this overhang thing and jump up. You could also take this route to get onto height. You could also jump on this grass, this sign, and then float up. Doing a medlev will take you across to this height. You could just barely medlev across this gap. You could use this high ground to jump over here, and you could use the satellite dish to jump up here. You could also float to this high ground here. You could hide in this corner by standing on this ledge. You could float back over this way. You can medlev over this wall. You can ledge bump onto these cases. You can float from this hill onto this high ground. You could use this counter to float up here. You can also use these railings. You can just barely make it onto the high ground here. You could stand on any of these speakers where the point captures. You can use these railings to float onto this height, or you could just float from here. You can use this railing to float onto the high ground, just barely, though you could do it without the railing if you use medlev, but doing it from this arcade machine is more consistent. You could jump up these boxes and rotate onto the high ground. This is slower, but you can medlev onto these boxes as well, and medlev across. You can juke somebody by floating around this way. If you need to leave this alleyway, you could just float onto this high ground. You can medlev from this planter up onto the height. You could float between these two high grounds. This is another potential juke spot. You could float across the river. You can medlev from the railing on the bridge into this window, as well as any of these windows on the other side. You could weave your way between these high grounds. You could stand against this bit against the wall. You could catch somebody off guard by floating around here back into the window. You could float on top of these boxes, and honestly, jumping on any of these boxes is nice. You could float onto the sign near spawn. You could get on top of these train cars in a couple of different ways. You could jump on these boxes. From here you can get onto any of the other train cars, including on top of this one. Another way to get on that top one is using these rocks. If you stand on the very edge of this train car, you can make it on top of this hoodoo. Though you could also medlev up there a little bit easier. One way to get onto high ground is by floating from this rock. You could also medlev to get on here a little bit higher up. You could jump on top of gas station or the billboard from here. You could stand on this edge of the sign here. You could float onto gas station from here. You could float onto these rocks, and even if this plant isn't here, you could float around on top of gas station. A more creative way is jumping on this sign and then floating on top of gas station. You could float onto this sign over here. If you need to leave high ground from here, you could float all the way over to this spot. You could retake high ground by jumping on this thing here and floating around. You could also float into this corner here instead. One fun spot to use is by standing here at the very edge of the map, and then when you need to, you could just float on up over here. You could float from this high ground onto the other one over here. You could also just barely float onto the garage from here. You could float from the top of these rocks onto this sheet metal bit. You could also medlev off of this electrical box onto that sheet metal. You have a few options to get on top of this building. You could float and catch just the middle part of this where it dips down. You could also jump on this part of this electrical box and then float over. You could also use the scaffolding on this part of the map. You could also jump on these rocks here and just barely make the jump over. Though using these rocks makes it a little bit less of a stretch. Once you're up here, you could float on top of this edge here. You could even stand on this outside edge. This spot is really good for spawn camping. You could shoot right into their spawn doors. You could medlev off of this dumpster to get back up to height. And you could also medlev off of this. You could use this motorcycle to jump on top of the outhouse and float on up this way. And from that outhouse, you could also medlev onto the height over here. You could float from here onto this other high ground. You could float on top of these shelves. Another niche spot is by doing a medlev by dropping off of this edge so that you don't bump your head, and so you pop up at just the right time to stand on this edge here. You could stand on this box. You could float over to this high ground, as well as this high ground here. You could just float over to this high ground now. If you float onto this shelf, then you can medlev over to this other high ground shelf, and from there you could actually stand on this edge here. You could fall onto any of these rocks near spawn. You could float over to this high ground here. You could use this stand or this taxi to jump onto here. You could float into the windows from this staircase. You could also medlev from here, as well as from here. You could float onto this tree spot. You could avoid touching the ground by floating around this way. You could float onto these ledges for these buildings. You could float onto this ledge. You could float from here into this building. If you want to spawn camp, you could float onto here and then do a medlev onto this high ground. A more simple way of spawn camping would be to float up to this rock area. You can float on top of this thing to stay off the ground. You can float up to this high ground, and you can float into this building as well. You could stand on each of these corners and on top of these boats. That includes these boats over to the side of point, as well as these rocks. You could skip the stairs by floating up here. You could get back up to high ground by floating here. You can clear this gap here. You could medlev out of spawn onto this bus. You could stand on the corner of this car and float on up. You could do the same thing by standing on the hood of this bus. From the top of this hill, you could just barely float onto this high ground. You could medlev from the middle of point up here. You could also medlev from this edge onto the high ground. You can alternate between these high grounds a bit faster than walking around. This high ground has the issue of not being able to fight a bit forward of it, but Ascendance solves that issue. You could stand on this bus stop. If you want to spawn camp at this point, you could stand on any of these tables, use this umbrella to bump yourself up, and stand here. You could just barely float onto these boxes out of spawn. You could float onto this thing from the stairs here. From there you could float onto this high ground. You can also float into this window. Another way is doing a medlev off of this edge to double jump into this window. You could use these boxes to float into this window. You could float from this railing to this high ground. You can also float from these pots up to the high ground, as well as from the pots into this window. From here you could float onto this rooftop, which gets you into this stuck spot. You could jump on these dumpsters and then float up here. You can float from the top of these stairs onto here to get up to this height faster. And while it's slower, you could technically ledge bump from here up. You can medlev from here onto the high ground. You could float here to get a nice off angle. But you could also stand on these corners to have some cover. You could hold a similar angle by floating off of this thing. And you could also use the outside corners as well for cover. The other nice thing about these corners is you could medlev to get onto this height. You could jump up to this height in a few ways. One is by jumping off of here, just float on the right side so you don't bump your head, and land on the corner of these rocks. You could also jump up here and then just float over. You could also stand on this rock and just barely float over. Probably the most consistent way is jumping up here and then doing a medlev across. A more intricate way to get up to this height, you could jump on these rocks, float over into this corner, and you could just barely float around the wall to get onto the ledge. Just make sure you don't go for this corner because it's a little higher up and won't let you on. One way to juke somebody is by floating around this wall back up here. You could jump over this wall by jumping on this bell, floating over, and then jump on this little box and you could just barely ledge bump over. You could stay off the ground by standing on any of these things here. One way is by floating from here, or using this edge on the left to get on here. Another is by floating from this edge. You could also medlev from here, and you could medlev from here. This one's a bit tricky, but you could medlev off of this gong. Hold a deep angle by floating off this statue, or using this snowbank. Another way to stay off the ground is by standing on either of these things. One sad thing about the rework is that we lost this funny spot right here. You can float into this area from here. If these boxes are destroyed, you could just float into this area, no problem. This spot doesn't actually work, but I want to just put it out there just in case someone else could find a way. I've also tried ledge bumping into the sign and unfortunately it doesn't work. You can float across these cars to get up here a little bit faster. You can float over this way to stand on top of these walls. You could float on top of any of these fountain things here, which over here you could avoid using the stairs if you need. You could ledge bump into these windows. You could float onto this bridge from here. You could float from the edge of this fountain up here, and you could float from this high ground to the other. You could do a medlev to jump up here. You could stand on this ledge and then jump up to the top here. You could float over to this tree thing. Using the railing, you could fall into this wall. You could ledge bump into this window. You could also ledge bump into this window on point, as well as up here. You could float around the edge of the map over here, as well as back. This spot's pretty difficult. You have to ledge bump and then land on just a very edge with basically no momentum. But then you could jump up. You could also do it from here by jumping on this ledge. I found using the ground here as kind of a lineup of sorts to be helpful. And from here you could float to this high ground too. Weirdly enough, I found this side of the map to be a little bit more consistent. That might just be me. And of course you could do it from this wall on this side as well. You could stand on this edge of the wall here, and that could help you float over to this high ground. You could float into this window with a ledge bump. You could also medlev into there from here. Once you're here, if you stand on the very tip of this railing, you can medlev onto this high ground here. You could float from this railing to the edge of this pillar here. This is one of the craziest spots I know. You could do a jump pad medlev from here to get high enough to float onto this tubing. You could also float onto the other side. Here's a couple other lineups for the same thing. And here it is again with a slow medlev. You can float onto this keyboard and float up here. You can do the same thing here as well. You can float over here, which takes you to this high ground, which takes you to this high ground, which takes you to this high ground, which takes you to this high ground. You could just barely make it from the jump pad over here. You could stand on top of this wall. It's tough to do, but if you medlev just right, you could jump up here and use that as a stall spot. You could jump onto the statue without the perk, but Ascendance lets you float back up. You could jump onto these rocks and then ledge bump onto the high ground. You could also use this shelf thing. You can also use this shelf to jump onto this carpet, onto the statue, and get up that way. The other side doesn't have the shelving against the rock, and it also doesn't have the carpet one here. You could also jump on the very edge of this chair, so you dump up your head here and float onto the statue. Or you could medlev onto the statue from here. On this side of the map, you could just jump onto this ledge to get into this window, but on this side you have to use Ascendance to get in there. You could float onto the pillar on this point, and you could stand on the edge of these rocks here, but on this side you can't stand on here at all. You could float from any of these boxes up to this high ground, and you could float up to the bridge from here. You could float up to the spawn door from here. You could avoid this room by floating around here. You could float around the wall here. You could float from these boxes onto the bridge. You could float from here into this doorway, or you could technically jump and just walk along these rocks here. Floating onto this box and floating from there is a lot easier. You could also float up there from this ramp. There's a lot of spots here in server room. You could jump on these rocks and float on top of the servers, and from there you could stand anywhere along this edge. Other ways to get up there is a medlev off of this toolbox, medlev from this staircase, or medlev from this spool of cable. From the back of this edge segment, you could medlev onto this rock. You could also medlev just beside it into this stuck spot. You can also stand on this doorway if you hold crouch. You could float onto this box, this forklift, and stand above this doorway here. You could stand on this edge here. You could medlev onto the corner of this box to get up to high ground. You could float onto the tip of this spaceship. And if the tip doesn't work, you could ledge bump onto this spool, jump on the box, and float a little bit deeper in. You could jump onto the wingtip here. Obviously, you could float to the high ground here, as well as over here. You can jump onto these boxes and float over to the bridge. You can float onto this stack of boxes, and then float onto the high ground here. There is a way to jump up here without medlevs that Overwatch Spot found. Go check out his channel. He found a lot of spots I found as well that I did not expect anyone else to find. He does really good research. However, this is a lot easier with medlevs. First, you could use this rock to jump onto this box, to jump onto this height here. And if you space it appropriately, you can medlev onto this rock. And from there, you can medlev onto this edge here. Then all you need to do is float around this pipe. On this side, you could medlev off of this box over the pipe. You could float from this high ground onto that same area. You could also access this corner of high ground, as well as this high ground here. You could flank by floating around the edge of the high ground here. Well, that's it. every Zenyatta float spot in Overwatch, with the side of a tech guide. This video took me way too long to make, about 6 months. Granted, not constantly working on it. It started as a no mobility parkour video, then perks were introduced to the game, so I pivoted and researched all the maps again, and then I discovered more and more tech with the Ascendance perks, so I had to research all the maps again. So I would really appreciate it if you gave this video a like and shared it around. Maybe subscribe. Oh, and check out my stream for some silly top 500 Zen gameplay and or my other socials to let me know what you think, especially anything about the tech, because holy did I find some crazy stuff. I'll hopefully be more frequent about uploading and streaming now that this video's out. No promises though, so stay tuned because I've got way more that I want to share. Anyway, have a good one and thanks for watching.